Funny thing about writing a sermon about imperfection and forgiveness and living accepting what is that you get to the church at 8 o'clock and want to rewrite the whole thing. Well, here we go. So this morning, many of our Christian neighbors in sanctuaries near and far who worship from a lectionary, from a series of texts over the course of 3 years, Christians who worship from a lectionary, many of them are reading this morning the story of Adam and Eve from the Hebrew Scriptures. And I wonder if, like me, you had the experience that as a child, this particular story was fascinating. It's embodied, it's elemental, it's got all of the parts of a good, intriguing story, this cast of characters, a God, a version of the divine who literally walks through a perfect garden in the cool of the day. Human beings, the text says, who are formed out of the dust, with life breathed into their lungs, forbidden fruit hanging from a tree, and a talking snake. It had everything that it needed to have to gain my attention as a young person, but I also remember that in the church I grew up in, this story drew my attention for a number of reasons. I was conflicted in how I read this story and heard about it. See, this is a story that's often told about human separation from God, about a transgression that would lead to a serious separation from the holy and the need for atonement. And I remember that the story told to me in the churches that I grew up in and on the playground conversations that we did have about these kinds of stories, well, we employed a lot more literal way of reading the Scriptures than we do in our congregation now. The version that I encountered was one where human imperfection, human pain, the need to work and have pain in childbirth, the reason that humans died, and the reason why I would die, I was told, was the result of this transgression. This one. I remember as a 6-year-old being angry at Adam and Eve for this. Yeah, we've got some other people who had the same experience. But I also remember being confused because I knew from my experience that the God of my knowing loved me. And at the same time, I was told that this holy presence responded so harshly, in such an extreme and final manner to a transgression that as a 6 or 7-year-old I could easily imagine myself doing. I remember that this was a complicated story for a lot of reasons, and as I read the text now as an adult, I recognize that this ancient story is too subtle to be accepted or rejected on a literal basis. I read in it traits about humanity that I recognize in myself. So when the two human beings realize after their transgression that they're naked, what do? They hide. Yeah, the God Yahweh's walking through the garden looking for them, and they're hidden. Is there a single person in this room who has not had the fear once in their life that they would be seen for who they were? And that when people knew everything about us, would we be cast out or embraced? I read in this story traits about human beings that I recognize, people who have a hard time admitting their limitations and their faults or saying I'm sorry, and people who have propensity for blaming others. When Yahweh comes looking for Adam and finds him and says, "What did you do?" He says, "That woman that you gave me did this." And then he goes to the woman and says, "What did you do?" And she says, "The serpent did this." And we don't have the serpent's version of the story here. I recognize people who wrote stories about human beings who were trying to live knowing that they fell short. The word Adam, used, is the Hebrew word not for a name of one person, it means human. It comes from the word for earth or dirt or dust. See, when we read that story in English, we're missing something really important. The Hebrew writers were calling us the dirt people, the earthlings. They knew in their symbol and metaphor that we are holy, beautiful creatures, muddy from the beginning. Perhaps this story is not so ancient. In other congregations around the city in the past few weeks, our Jewish neighbors have just finished marking the day of Yom Kippur, the holiest day in their calendar, a day that's set aside solely for the purpose of atonement. In their tradition, adherents are asked to reflect on their past year and note those moments where they have fallen short of right relationship with God, with themselves, and with other human beings, and to seek reconciliation. The idea being that by this moment in their calendar, the day of Yom Kippur, they would enter the new year with a clean slate in the book of life. We don't use that word atonement a lot in Unitarian Universalist churches, but I don't think we have to know that we struggle with the same kinds of issues. I wonder if there's anybody in the room who hasn't fallen short of a promise that they've made, or found that someone else fell short of a promise that they made, or trying to figure out how do I show who I really am and still love and be loved? How do I make things right? It seems a little countercultural to institutionalize and ritualize the act of saying, I'm sorry. In fact, Daniel and I were talking earlier this week and kind of half joking, wondering what this means for Unitarian Universalists. I wonder what it would look like if we had our version of this celebration, if we said to you, this is a Sunday you will not want to miss. You are going to admit to every fault you've had over the last year, any transgression against human or God, and come into the service in a ritual of acknowledging these shortcomings and saying, I'm sorry. We wondered what attendance would look like on that Sunday. We are a good people. We're also a people who can so easily want to wear that mask of success and self-sufficiency and professionalism, and I can take care of this on my own. Thank you very much. I don't think I have to tell you that with less than a month to go before a presidential election, the way that we talk about one another is important. The volume on our interactions and the anxiety and the vitriol that we have with ourselves and others seems turned up right now. People are already getting cast out of the garden, and the election's not even over. In society, it feels like our basic level of trust in one another is pretty low. That we're ready to have a single transgression or a single difference cast somebody out of the garden. I know I'm practiced in this myself. I know that I often secretly struggle with a society that tells us that we are not quite good enough by wondering if I were fully seen by my family and friends and even church community. What does that look like? Are we embraced? Are we cast out when we come to the room as the people we really are? So my question for us in this room today is, in a life where it is so easy to keep score and to lay blame, how will we in this room practice grace? I think that in a paradox, one of the ways that we actually practice grace with others is by asking for an apology ourselves. In that poem that Daniel read to us from Narc Nepo this morning, he said, my efforts now turn from trying to outrun suffering to accepting love wherever I can find it. That phrase, trying to outrun suffering, really resonated with me. How much of our soul's energy is spent in that place? Constantly trying to outrun suffering, seeking the next fix for the next problem, holding a version of ourselves in the room or the family or the workplace that is just perfect enough to make sure that the people in that place will keep liking or loving me. The poet said, we cannot eliminate loneliness, but we can hold each other. We cannot eliminate pain, but we can live lives of compassion. I think he's talking about what it means to live outside the garden. In a world where we know that life nor we have to be perfect in order to be good. In fact, he calls this place in which we dwell flawed abundance. How will we extend grace? See, I think beginning with an honest apology, even for a little thing. I'm not so sure I'm talking about the biggest transgressions or the most difficult acts of forgiveness to ourselves and others in this life. I think I'm talking about the everyday actions. Beginning with an honest apology is a really difficult spiritual practice because when I say I'm sorry to you, I have to trust you to remain in relationship with me beyond my faults. I'm trusting that if I say I'm sorry, you're going to continue believing we have a life together that is bigger than our mistakes. And I think it's actually an act of grace to others because when we do apologize out loud, it says to the people around us, I believe in a world where our mistakes are not the end of the story. And I'm willing to include you in that picture. Now, I know that the issue of dealing with imperfection and forgiveness and what it means to live a complicated human life is something that comes up over and over again in our worship here, and I'm not ignorant of the fact that it's a very common theme in my own preaching, and there's a reason for that. I get the impression that we live in a current society and culture in a time where we do not extend a lot of grace to each other. We easily worship small loyalties and small deities. We easily put ourselves into tiny camps at the very same time that we're being required to cooperate on a human scale that we've never seen before just so that this planet and our species can survive. I think one of the biggest questions we will have to ask in our era is, how do we live well together, being different, flawed, and good, all at the same time? How will I contribute to the common good? Our theme here, how will I serve and engage the world not as the person I want to be, but as the person I am? You see, we can so easily worship and kneel at tiny altars and worship the gods of success and prosperity and self-righteousness and perfection. And I promise you that when we worship at those altars, those gods will always judge. Because we can never meet the mark. And our Unitarian Universalist community is not exempt from the temptations to hold success and perfection and self-sufficiency as minor deities at the least. Our Universalist ancestors put forward the notion of a God that would not say no to humanity. This was a God that said, I love you and there's nothing you can do about it. A God that would not let human beings go. A God that was personified grace. A few weeks ago we talked about Hosea Ballou here in the sanctuary, and he had this image of God. He was a Universalist minister in the 1800s. And he put forward this notion of God that I love. He tried to describe the holy as a parent who has come across a child who's fallen into the mud and is stained and dirty. And he asked the people that he was addressing, do we wash the child because we love them? Or do we love them only when they're clean? See, he saw a notion of the divine that didn't wait for us to be free of transgressions or perfect before we were deserving of love. But I don't think it's just the job of God to extend grace. Not even the Universalist one. In our tradition, we've talked about the fact that there's no such thing as the immaculate conception of virtue. What that means is that if grace and forgiveness and trust are to exist in the world, they have to be embodied by our lives. That the way we talk to one another and that the way we live and act can be evidence of a world in which our mistakes are not the end of the story. I know that the call this Sunday is not new. It's ancient and common, and it's something that I struggle with all the time. How do we practice grace with ourselves and the people in our lives? I think the paradox there is that we begin by asking for it ourselves. Admitting to the people that we live with and love that we believe there is a goodness beyond any flaw. The poet this morning wrote, "The dream is awakened when thinking I love you, and life begins when saying it." I think he's giving voice to the power of saying some things out loud. The fact that we know that the things that go without saying often bear repeating. And so today I'll invite you to do the thing we said we thought is hard. To say these things out loud. I'll invite you to read responsively with me words that are printed in your order of service. They come from our Unitarian Universalist colleague, Rob Eller Isaacs, and are adapted from some of his words that are in Yom Kippur. It's just under the sermon. It's a small response. The words are, "We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love." Now, I'll invite you only to say this if you want to and you mean it. Because when we do speak things like this aloud, the funny thing is it creates, even for just this moment, evidence of a world where we believe that there is goodness beyond our flaws. Even if it's just for the next few moments, there's power in saying those things together. And so, if you want to, and if this morning you can say these words with integrity, I'll invite you to respond with me. For remaining silent when a single voice would have made a difference, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For each time that our fears have made us rigid and inaccessible, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For each time that we have struck out in anger without just cause, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For every time that our greed has blinded us to the needs of others, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. For these and so many acts which have fueled the illusion of separateness, we forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love. Maybe we are living outside the garden, but neither life nor we have to be perfect in order to be good. And my earthling friends, remember that we are here for a very short time. You have the opportunity to fill your days and this world with more moments of grace than it currently has. Good luck in the task. May it be so today and all days. Amen.